Hello, this is a recording for the Suffolk Jungian group primarily. At the end of May, we're having an online discussion of Jung and his views of UFOs. And as with all of these previous discussions, if you're listening to this recording and you'd like to take part in that discussion, let me know and I'll email you the link. And even if you don't wish to take part in the discussion or you're not able to, nonetheless, if you would like to comment, give some feedback, that would be interesting to read. Jung was fascinated for quite a few years by the idea of UFOs and wrote various letters and comments on them. He didn't really talk about the issue as to whether or not UFOs were actually aliens, spaceships from some other planet, dimension or whatever. Rather, he took the more psychological approach of trying to understand what the idea of UFOs meant to people. So I'm going to kind of stick with that for the sake of this discussion rather than getting involved in the debate about whether or not there is alien life. For the record, I am quite positive that there must be. In the universe, there must be planets that are inhabited, and possibly some of the creatures inhabiting some of those planets are technologically advanced. I'm sure plenty aren't, but some might be technologically advanced, possibly to the point where they could travel at an interstellar level. Whether they'd want to come to Earth or not, I have no idea. So whether the weird things in the sky that people see actually are spaceships and so forth, I don't know. I've seen one or two weird things at times, but I've no idea what they were. They are unidentified. But we'll stick with this idea for Carl Jung, that the fascination is with the meaning rather than the literalism of whether or not aliens exist, whether or not spaceships come to Earth. He talks about incidences reported from hundreds and hundreds of years ago in places like Basel and Nuremberg, where people recorded seeing weird things in the sky. They talk about lights and balls and spheres and things appearing to fight with one another. Different points in history, people have talked about gods flying past in chariots. They've talked about angels in the skies. They've talked in various terms about what we might broadly call weird stuff in the sky. And Jung, like a variety of other writers, has taken the idea that perhaps regardless of the language used in an era, that is to say, whether the language is religious and it's all gods and angels and whatnot, or whether the language is more that of scientific terminology and people are talking about spaceships and creatures from other dimensions, they're all seeing the same kind of stuff. And just putting different labels, different interpretations on what they're seeing. Now, Jung takes the idea that there is a sort of an underlying theme that what people are seeing almost entirely, there are perhaps some exceptions to this, but almost entirely are things coming down from the sky, things in the sky. They're not seeing things emerge from the earth or bubble up from the oceans, although there have been one or two sightings of people seeing weird stuff coming out of the seas. But generally speaking, it is top down, as it were. It's stuff either hovering above us or descending from the sky to land on the earth. And that therefore gives it a sort of metaphorical role that we are looking up at wonders and mysteries. And he understands the process, the kind of psychological process, in a number of different contexts. Partly he talks about the idea of ships of death that in times of great social upheaval and great turmoil, which can be on the big scale, big social scale, earthquakes and tidal waves and plagues and wars and things that affect massive numbers of people at the same time. Or sometimes he also thinks in the context of personal, individual upheaval. So a particular person, the person who sees the UFO, their life is in a state of turmoil, even if most other people's lives are not at that point in time. And so the weird things in the sky come in and particularly where it's a big social upheaval and lots of people are suffering and dying, he is connecting the weird things in the sky with this idea that, as with the Nordic cultures believing that in times of great battle, the Valkyries would ride in and pick up the souls of the noble, brave, honourable warriors who'd fallen on the battlefield and carry them off to Valhalla. That there is an urge, a yearning for people for big scale death to make sense. So it's not just random carnage and meaningless chaos, rather that there is some kind of purpose, some kind of meaning, some kind of significance that, well, doesn't necessarily make the deaths okay, but makes the grand scale loss a little bit more bearable, if there is some kind of meaning and significance. And this perhaps overlaps to some extent, at any rate, with the ideas of people like Viktor Frankl, who talk about the ability to invest meaning in tragedy being the function, the capacity that gets us through the tragedy, helps us to cope with it if we can impose a meaning upon it. And for him, it's a kind of a created, imposed meaning, rather than a meaning that is integral to the event that has to be sought for and delved for. Rather, it's kind of whatever you project onto it. As long as it means something to you, that will help you cope. And so Jung isn't necessarily saying that these actually are Valkyries or angels or anything of that sort coming down to take away the souls of the dying. Rather, he's saying that there is the yearning for something to make sense of death and chaos and mayhem, and the idea that there is some sort of celestial power, whether it's a divine power or an alien intelligence from another planet or whatever it may be, something that comes in and somehow shows that there is a significance to the deaths by taking the souls of the dead away, garnering them up, possibly even somehow causing deaths. So it's not just random mayhem by human beings, it's a divine intervention. And even in a very negative light, he's still arguing that there's a kind of yearning for meaning there. So I'm thinking, the incident that leaps to my mind, there may have been others chronologically closer to 2025, but going back a good few years now to when there was a huge tsunami that killed umpty 100,000 people. There were priests and bishops and imams and what have you going on respective news channels in different countries saying that this was God's judgment on people for tolerating sin and sexual depravity, and all these gay clubs and swinging parties and orgies and God knows what was going on in the mostly kind of holiday countries. God or Allah or whoever was absolutely irate, and this was this terrible tsunami, all these drownings and deaths were an expression of divine wrath, even though I'm sure 99% of the people who drowned weren't going to any of these clubs and orgiastic gatherings and what have you. Do I think that there is a divine power that sits up there having a bitch fit and killing umpty 100,000 people as a punishment for what a tiny handful of people get up to? No, I don't. But it's a common thing when you can go back to ancient Greek myths and the idea that Poseidon is irate because some king has done something or other and causes a great tidal wave that drowns 10,000 people in a city because the king did something. So again, it's a very similar idea. A small number of people do something to pay off the gods, and the gods cause some grand scale disaster that wipes out a huge number of people who had absolutely nothing to do with whatever naughty thing the handful of sinful people have been getting up to. Why do we keep kind of interpreting grand scale carnage as a power from above descending and sending a lightning bolt to splatter everyone? Well, Jung is saying it makes something that is very meaningless, or could easily be viewed as meaningless, chaos, mayhem. Why have all these people died? No particular reason, just bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. Doesn't mean anything. Just your entire family have been wiped out and it doesn't mean anything. Tough luck, never mind, oh dear. Very difficult to cope with that kind of mentality. Whereas if you can say, all my family have been wiped out because that bloody king did so and so, or that bunch of foreign tourists came over here for a gangbang, or this happened, or that happened, it's somebody's fault. That kind of makes it more copable. You've got a focus for your anger, for your wrath. You've also got maybe a sort of an illusion of control, where you could say, if we don't allow this behaviour to happen again, we don't allow the next king to do the naughty thing, we don't allow the next bunch of tourists to do the naughty thing, then we can prevent future disasters happening by not irritating the gods, or the god in an individual sense, whoever it is that's caused this terrible thing to happen. And I suppose, getting a little bit science fiction-y, you think all the sort of science fiction films and novels and what have you, if you don't irritate the Martian overlords, they won't send their death rays to splatter everyone. That a kind of mentality again, that if you can suck up to the powers that be, the ones that are far more powerful than you, then they won't visit death and destruction upon you. Or if they do, maybe it's someone else's fault somehow, rather than your fault or the fault of your family that's been wiped out. It gives some kind of meaning and context. So this idea that something comes in from above and it either causes the death and chaos, or if it doesn't actually cause it, it at least takes the souls away, and there's something a bit kinder going on there, that it's taking up the souls of the noble, of the innocent, of the brave, of the wise, of the whatever qualities are required to be carried up to the afterlife. There is some kind of salvation going on that makes the tragedy a little bit less awful, a little bit less horrendous. So it's that search, in a sense, for something that gives a degree of meaning. In terms of why it comes down from above rather than bubbling up from below, many cultures have had the idea that down is somehow a little bit scary. That's either the hellish regions, or it's where the giants live, or where the scary monsters live in caves under the ground. Some other quite frightening thing is downwards, whereas upwards is where the gods live, where the angels live, where the benevolent forces live. And that seems to repeat in many cultures around the world, and many different religions and mythologies and traditions have this idea of down being a bit scary and up being more desirable, more benevolent. We could go for a slightly Jungian interpretation there and say maybe down is into the unconscious mind, into the shadow. You go down into the shadow, you descend into the unconsciousness, and Jung uses that language himself quite often. The idea of sinking into something that's chaotic and frightening and disturbing and has the power to dissolve what you've built up over time, whether that's your communities and your cities and your relationships, or whether that's your own sense of identity and ego and so on, that gets washed away by the tidal waves of the unconscious mind. Whereas maybe going up is going into the more cerebral realms, the realms of order and calm, that sort of, as some would say, that sort of Apollonian realm, of something a little bit more peaceable, rather than the Dionysiac realms of chaos that exist by going downwards. So that's perhaps a repetition of concepts that crop up again and again and again in various different understandings. And Jung, as well as writing about cases from hundreds and hundreds of years ago where people are talking about weird stuff in the sky, was quite taken by Orfeo Angelucci, who was an Italian chap who said that he had this UFO encounter. He'd seen weird things in the sky, and they'd landed, and several figures appeared and spoke to him. Very beautiful figures, very inspirational figures. And they talked to him about the nature of the soul. They talked to him about Jesus being this entity associated with the sun, and all sorts of other things, and gave him guidance. And then he wrote books and gave talks and went on lecture tours. and lots of people were quite keen on his ideas, and he became a bit of a cause celeb. Jung was quite taken with that, or fascinated with. He didn't believe Angelucci as such, that he really had seen creatures from another planet. He felt that Angelucci was kind of misinterpreting his own experience, that what Angelucci was really having was an individuation encounter with his own higher self, rather than actual beings from another planet. And that he'd misinterpreted this. What was a vision for his own personal spiritual growth was now being turned into a kind of sermon, a sales pitch to preach to other people and convert them to ideas, which I suppose a bit like Carol's talk in April when she was mentioning the Red Book, and the idea that Jung felt that was very much for him. He wasn't trying to set a blueprint that other people should feel obliged to follow. Each person had to find their own journey through their psyche and not just assume that their journey would somehow resemble his journey. That he probably felt that Angelucci was having his own private journey, and that by preaching it, it was giving other people the misunderstanding, misapprehension, that they should also be having some very similar experience, or following the kind of pattern that Angelucci's higher self was instructing him to follow. And of course, Angelucci isn't the only person to have had weird experiences of aliens telling them things, and then writing a book or going on television or whatever and talking about it and creating a slightly, what should we say, cult-like atmosphere of other people going, "Oh, tell us what the alien said. We want to know what the alien said as well," and feeling that would give their life more meaning. Rather, Jung would be saying they need to do their own psychological self-analysis, do their own work, find their own inner voices, not assume that there was this kind of standardized voice, one size fits everyone, one set of instructions fits everybody, which is what we've got a tendency to do. Religion, to a large extent, is this idea that there was some prophet who gave a set of instructions that apply to umpty million people and we should all be following them, which is not Jung's ideas. So he felt that kind of needed addressing. He does go on to talk in one of his books about the idea of the transitional ages, the sort of astrological ages, and the idea that we have emerged from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, which was hugely popular, especially in the 60s and 70s as an idea. The whole kind of hippie movement and the birth of the New Age movement a little bit later, this notion that we are going into the age of Aquarius and it's going to be a time of great transition and great change, great development. Very rarely hear people talk about that in 2025. It seems to have sort of fallen by the wayside as a fad, as an idea to talk about. Or at least maybe I just move in the wrong social circles. Maybe there are lots of people talking about it, I just don't move in those circles. But this notion that we are going through a very transitional phase, and in some respects he's kind of reflecting ideas from Durkheim, when Durkheim is talking about anomie, which happens when there is too much very rapid social change and people can't get used to it, and they feel society is falling apart around them, and they feel very cut off from society and get very isolated and sink into this dysfunctional emotional state of anomie. That when there is a lot of social change and upheaval, both currently but also expected, that we have an expectation that tomorrow and the day after and the month after and the decade after is going to be more and more and more and more change, more rapid, more upheaval, more this, more that, more the other. That we look for signs and meanings and omens and guidance. We want some kind of intervention that will come along and somehow make sense of it. And that for a lot of people, the idea of whether it's benevolent gods, kindly angels, or wise alien entities on some other planet or some other dimension of existence, there will be some higher power that comes in and says, calm down, love, this is what is happening, this is what you need to know, this is what you need to do, here's some guidance, now get on with it. Because we during periods of upheaval, feel that there is no guidance. We don't know if we're coming, going, been or gone. We don't know how to adjust to what's going on around us. And we start looking for someone who can step in and say, here's some reassurance, here's some direction, here's a blueprint, here's a map, this is what you need to do. And so for a lot of people there is the hope, and there's certainly a few different kind of movements. I'm trying to avoid saying the word cult again because it has a bit of a negative connotation, but there are some movements in which people do look to alien powers as being benevolent and kindly and steering them and guiding them. There are also, of course, movements and 101 films and TV shows and novels and what have you, in which the aliens are not benevolent. They are scary and destructive, and they turn up and kill everyone, and it gets all very H.G. Wells, and the Martians arrive and slaughter everybody in sight, or eat us, or enslave us, or do something equally horrible and terrible to us. And that was something that Jung was also conscious of, this idea that the interventional powers might be frightening, they might be dangerous, they might be these kind of shadow presences that come in. And in one of his commentaries, he mentions that if there were concrete proof, because when he was writing in the 50s, there were weird blips on radar screens and blurry photographs and things like that, but not what you'd call hard and fast impressive proof of alien existence. It was all a bit on the evidential front. So, but he says in one of these commentaries that if there were, Martians landed on your front lawn and there was no denying it anymore, there they were, concrete and solid and leaving footprints in the mud, then it would kind of be the end of everything, he feels. And he makes some, what these days are probably not terribly politically correct, but who cares about that, comments around colonialisation. The idea that human history has been an incessant stream of imperialist cultures colonising other parts of the world, and any country they could lay waste to and take over and utilise for resources and slaves and anything else that they could get. When technologically less developed civilizations are confronted by the presence of very, well, compared to them at any rate, very technologically advanced civilizations, it's hugely overwhelming. This bunch of strange people come from way away with all sorts of ships and weapons and contraptions and things that are completely alien in the old-fashioned sense, completely strange to the colonised culture, and bring in new languages, new religions, new ways of dressing. Everything is weird and strange and new, and their own culture gets kind of drowned and lost and abandoned. And even the people who aren't outright slaughtered or killed off by strange viruses, the survivors of the native cultures never really go back to the way things were, because this new culture's come in and just totally chucked everything up in the air and made it different. And Jung was arguing that if some alien race arrived tomorrow, for real, up front, public, I know lots of people think the aliens are already here. If they actually turned up in the full glare of publicity and made themselves known, then, well, obviously to travel at an interstellar level, they would have to have a technology thousands of years in advance of what we have, that our human civilizations would be absolutely overwhelmed and fall into a heap. We would be like the natives in some South Seas island, faced by these weird-looking, strangely behaving, phenomenally advanced people from way away, and our cultures would fall into nothingness as a result. Even if they didn't eat us all or kill us all with alien viruses or something, we would nonetheless collapse in a heap. And so there is a sort of a threatening element there of something that's too much. And even if you go back to a more psychological interpretation, and it's less about actual aliens, the idea of maybe a profound archetypal force, some aspect of the psyche that's way more developed than the rest of the psyche that comes in and overwhelms it, like kind of putting your fingers in a plug socket. The energy just boom overwhelms you, and it's too much, and your ego and everything else falls into a heap, and it's nigh on impossible to rebuild and recover. That sometimes the descent of something stellar is too much, and it needs to be kind of managed a little bit. He talks at length about this idea of flying saucers and cylindrical vessels and the kind of simplistic look of the shapes, or at least the way they were, I guess, being described back in the 40s and 50s, if not so much the way they've been described in the decades since Carl Jung died, which perhaps has got a bit more complicated. But he saw the simplicity of the visual descriptions as in itself symbolic of this yearning for wholeness. And again, we're back to this idea that in times of chaos, where everything feels as if it's falling apart, whether at a private level or at a shared collective level, what we yearn for is things to come together, things to be unified, things to be whole, and we seek symbols of simplicity rather than symbols of complexity, because what we want is simplicity rather than complexity. Chaotic lives are very complicated lives. Orderly, structured, harmonious lives are much more simplistic, and that's what we're yearning for. And so the flying weird things in space become a symbol of the simplicity that we would like. And I was going back to the idea, for those who believe in benevolent aliens, that the aliens come in and bring harmony, or offer guidance that brings harmony and structure and order and a better way of living, and this often idea that, you know, maybe the aliens watch humanity and all of the endless wars and tortures and enslavements and sexual abuses and grand scale pollution and the extinction of so many other species on the planet as we behave appallingly. And the aliens are all these beings of light and wisdom and loveliness, and they kind of come in and put us to rights, get us living the way we should be living, rather than in the chaotic, deranged manner that we have spent the last couple 100,000 years living. I'm just conscious of the time, so we'll wind up by a few ideas I thought might be interesting, kind of branching off slightly from Carl Jung. There's an American political writer, Jody Dean, who I tripped across whilst researching Jung's views of UFOs, who has drawn parallels with ideas of UFOs and aliens and strange creatures from other planets with the way we understand each other at a human level. So if we live in a very, I was going to say a very multicultural society, but in fairness, I don't think it even needs to be multicultural in the sense of people from foreign countries living next door to you. If it's people from a town 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles away from you, with a different accent and different kind of attitudes or whatever, who come and live next door to you, that can also create a sense of alienation, a sense of strangeness. So it's not necessarily that they have to be of a different skin colour or speak a foreign language. It could just be that they've got a different accent from a different part of the same country. But the feeling that we often, and again, kind of echoing back a little bit to Durkheim, I suppose, and Weber, when human communities build up to the point that there's more people than you can reasonably know, so you're no longer living in some pokey little village where you know absolutely everyone else. You now live in a town or a city where you don't know half the people around you. That there is a process of alienation, a process in which people become strange. Initially, perhaps you just don't know their name. You don't know who's married to who, or who is a child of who else, or how they all interconnect with each other. And of course, if they do have different regional accents, or they come from a different country and they speak a different language and have a different religion and blah blah blah, then that accentuates the strangeness, that they become strange in additional ways. to you, and harder for you to understand them and harder for them to understand you, vice versa, that we often, and this is Dean's argument, often struggle to understand other human beings, let alone Martians or Neptunians or whatever from some other part of the cosmos. And so science fiction films and books and whatnot are kind of emblematic, symbolic if you like, for not just how we one day might end up having to deal with creatures with 6 heads and 15 tentacles, but how we currently deal with strangers of the human variety. People whose ways are different from our ways, whose outlooks are different from our outlooks, where we don't quite know, are they a friend or are they a threat? Are they benevolent or are they a menace? Do they bring hope and opportunity, or do they bring mayhem and destruction and tyranny and terrible things? Jung and others have spoken a little bit about crop circles as part and parcel of this, and the idea of symbolic communication, strange ways of communicating, where again we're looking for odd signs that have a connection to the above. And in a similar vein, people with a very different accent or speaking a different language, or maybe having a different religion, and the symbols, the jewellery and the dress codes and whatnot that go with that religion are different forms of symbols that we may struggle to understand and interpret. So there's a sort of analogies being drawn there between day-to-day life and not only works of fiction, but things like the corn circles, stuff that occurs in the real world where people sit there and think, oh, what does that mean? Don't understand that, that's strange. Is it an alien language? Is it this? Is it that? Is it the other? And they try to interpret. But Dean also flags up the idea of alien abduction. I don't, off the top of my head, know how many people back in the 40s and 50s, when Jung was looking at the subject, how many people were claiming to be abducted by aliens. There were certainly people saying they'd seen UFOs and they'd seen weird things getting out of spaceships. But I don't know off the top of my head when the popularity of abduction became a kind of phenomenon. Although you can obviously go back to medieval stories about people being abducted by the fairies, and certainly a lot of people have argued there is this essential idea, whether you're being abducted by the fairies or whether you're being abducted by the Venusians, it's the same kind of an idea playing out in mythology and story and folktale. The difference that Dean highlights is that when the aliens invade or a foreign nation colonises your country, there is a hope one day of overthrowing them, of getting rid of them. So again, back H.G. Wells, and the Martians arrive and eventually they are overthrown, well, admittedly by the paraviruses rather than human organisation, but they are overthrown and people are liberated from the oppressive alien force, the oppressive foreign presence. They get rid of it and go back to doing things their own way, kind of. Although I think we're inevitably revisiting this idea that once that invasion, colonisation, whatever you want to call it, has happened, you can never wholly go back. You can never wholly return, because the presence of the power that dominated your life, even after it's overthrown, remains. The kind of legacy of it remains, and that changes everything. But the idea of abduction for Dean is that once the aliens have got you, well, that's it. You've got no hope whatsoever of being liberated. And obviously a lot of, well, we wouldn't know abduction stories at all, would we, if people didn't say that the aliens let them go at the end of it. If they were abducted and the aliens just ate them or took them as kidnapped victims to another planet never to be seen again, then we wouldn't have any stories about abductions. There'd be no survivors to tell about it. So the presence of the story necessitates the person being freed. And I think, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of alien abduction, but I think usually the format in most of these accounts is that the human being is set free, as opposed to escaping by their own cunning, out the back door of the spaceship when the aliens aren't looking. So there is a release there, but it's a release of the benevolence, as it were, of the abducting power, rather than by your own ingenuity, or, as per the H.G. Wells story, by the random presence of a kind of deus ex machina that comes along and sets people free. And for Dean, that's kind of more frightening and more disturbing as an idea, that there is a power greater than us that once it's got us, we can do nothing against. We have no capacity to overcome it. And I suppose you could see that in lots of other contexts, couldn't you? People who've been held hostage by a gang of kidnappers or something, or had a relative inducted into some dodgy brainwashing cult, and it's practically impossible to get them out of it. That idea that there is some power that's almost impossible to do anything about. It's there, and you just have to kind of put up and shut up, that you can't do anything to get free from it. And that's an idea she kind of takes and explores in various different contexts. And maybe it's something we can think about in the discussion group. These different ideas, stories of benevolent aliens, stories of malevolent, frightening, disturbing aliens, the idea of a colonising alien force, the idea of a force that abducts and takes you away. So colonisers, they come and live where you are. Abductors take you to where they are, and you never get to come back again. Obviously, there's a metaphor there with slavery. Throughout the whole of human history, people have been enslaved and taken away from one country and carted off to some other country. Still goes on. There's more people in slavery today than there ever was 300 odd years ago. People get trafficked and may never see their home country again. And while they're in the grip of the gang, it must be practically impossible to fight against that gang. So there's kind of slightly more earthly parallels that can be drawn, as well as these weird and wonderful tales of people being abducted by little green men from another dimension. But we can discuss all of that in the group. I think I'll leave it there for the moment and see what people think.